Aickman is a master at bending time, place, and identity. Hello everyone, happy October. Welcome to Read the Right Thing Book Reviews. I'm Eric, thanks for tuning in. Compulsory Games is a collection of 8 horror short stories by the British author Robert Aickman. I hadn't heard of Aickman before, and a comment from Donald on one of my other videos recommended a few short story authors, and Robert Aickman was one of them. So thanks for the comment and thanks for the recommendation. Now, I didn't get through all of the short stories in this collection. I'm just going to review one today. I'm actually in the middle of reading American Pastoral by Philip Roth, and a review of that will be coming soon. But this October, I was in the mood for some horror, and I checked this out from the library, and it really delivered. I liked it so much, I'm sure I'm going to return back to this book and read some of the other stories. The characters, as well as the setting, are so normal, it's almost monotonous. Aickman is known for sort of this very British humor and way of storytelling. In the first several pages, I asked myself, how can this turn out to be a horror story? After all, there are no ghosts, monsters, or scary settings, so what's going to be scary about this? And the horror comes from something a lot more subtle. It's sort of like how a weird woman seems to live alone, isolated, bored of life. How she walks around her house pouring coffee from a pot. Eerie stuff like that. When we get to this isolated woman, I finally think, okay, this is the part. She's probably going to end up being some creepy older woman who goes on a murderous tear. But that's not what happens. Everything that happens in the story is very realistic until the end. There is a couple, Colin and Grace, who live in this neighborhood and get to know a solitary, lonesome older woman. This woman's name is Eileen McGrath. Eileen seems to have no personality or identity and just seems very lonely. Grace goes to India to look after her dying mother, and while she is there, Colin dines one night with Eileen. During this dinner, he continues to notice her peculiarity and her loneliness, but he also notices how she is still beautiful and attractive. While they are talking, he mentions how she should probably find a hobby and how there's still a lot of life left to live. Things start to get weird when Grace returns and Eileen completely disappears from their lives. They no longer see Eileen, and Grace decides they'll give it a few days and then she's gonna go check on her. So Grace checks up on Eileen one Sunday, and when she comes back, she tells Colin that they've decided to take up flying lessons together. And Colin kind of brushes this off. He just thinks it's going to be a phase, like, oh, she said the same thing to me. She wants to fly an airplane. Whatever, go ahead. What happens is Grace slowly spends less and less time with Colin until she never comes home. She writes Colin a letter saying the two have decided to move to a home closer to the airport. And Grace leaves Colin slowly and happily. She's never seemed happier in her life. And it starts subtly. A missed dinner here or a missed dinner there, her not being there when he comes home from work, until she is completely absent from his life. Colin's life is turned upside down, and with it, his identity evaporates before his eyes. Colin is now alone and confused as to how this happened. Eileen, of all people, stole his wife away. The most boring woman stole away his wife, life, and with it, his identity and maybe his sanity. Colin hears the roaring and buzzing of a constant airplane above him. It's called a moth airplane. And I looked it up, and it's kind of like those crop duster airplanes that you see in old farm movies. This plane haunts him everywhere he goes. It is described as a buzzing horror to Colin and appears to have no pilot. And Colin is even afraid of the plane's shadow. So this guy is just mentally just so messed up right now. When he's on the street and the plane is above him, he zigzags across the street to avoid its shadow. And the neighborhood kids laugh at him. Aickman describes his horror. It's haunting, but it's also just straightforward. He almost writes it just matter-of-factly. For example, Grace failed to return and Eileen failed to return. But to compensate, the big red noisy moth came back often. It can't really be big, thought Colin. It must really be quite small. The enormous shadow it casts must be a trick of the light, refraction or something of that kind. Colin remembered the term from the Children's Encyclopedia, his own childhood set. All the same, he deemed it unwise to challenge that shadow, to let it fall on him. In fact, he would dodge from side to side of the street to prevent any chance of this happening, and drifting around Kensington Gardens had become impossible, because his dartings about made the children giggle and follow. The simplest and most obvious thing was to remain as far as possible indoors, at home, as it is called. When he was safely shut up with the curtains drawn, there was only the noise to worry about, though that could be very unpleasant indeed. So you can see this man slowly start to lose his mind. And he's questioning even how big or how far away an airplane could be. And Colin also starts to forget what Grace even looked like. who she was as this person, what she sounded like. And Grace and Eileen start to blend together into one person. We're not sure how much time has passed, and I assume that not a lot of time has passed at all. So it is interesting that already his thoughts would begin to blur, and he would blur these two people together. Colin tries to get away from familiar surroundings, and he is clearly not himself, and he's trying to hold on to whatever of his sanity and identity he can. He decides to vacation to a place he's never been before, and one day while wandering in the garden of a hotel, he sees 3 other people. The 3 people seem distant at first, but then they are fastly encroaching upon him. They are rapidly intruding while simultaneously appearing the same distance as before. The closer they get, Colin realizes that the people end up being himself, and he sees himself smiling back at him. Then there is a cold, ear-destroying shriek, and then the plane once again is heard and hurtles down towards him. But despite everything, he became aware that they were encroaching. It was the only word for it. Not only were they no longer where they had been, but much, much closer. They were also very positively intruding and ousting. He could feel the combined thrust of them and that he was shrinking beneath it, while very curiously, at the same time he could see them standing over there, still keeping their distance apparently, albeit so much nearer than before. Moreover, the horizon had begun once more to buzz. The 3 figures were now differently related to one another. 2 very near, the third considerably more distant. Colin strained his eyes to identify this further figure. In the end, there was no need for strain. The far figure was himself, smiling broadly. This was what would survive of him forever, if survive was at all the word, if there was a word. The ending is very abrupt, but also very, very creepy. There's no explanation of events of what happened, other than that time is warped, place is warped, and this man's identity is somewhat warped. Aickman is a master at bending time, place, and identity. And that's where the horror really lies. And it's really a cool way to do horror. More of the psychological kind. You know, no jump scares, no monsters, just pure, unexpected psychological horror. Well, that was just a quick review of the short story Compulsory Games by Robert Aickman. What's your favorite story by Robert Aickman? Let me know in the comments. If you found this review helpful, please hit that like button. It would just get this video out to more people who would enjoy it. Once again, thanks for tuning in. See you next time.